go right ahead.
We then found, well, again, we had identified
an element,
a super heavy element, one that doesn't naturally occur on Earth, and certainly one that we haven't synthesized. This element was identified as 115. Now, normally, the higher level elements, the ones that we have produced in accelerators, decay in a fairly short time. In this case, what we were seeing was a stable element, one that was not undergoing any radioactive decay, which is very unusual. However, again, this is something that science and chemists have already theorized, that there should be an island, essentially an island of stability for elements around the 114, 115, 116 area. However, we certainly haven't been able to produce anything that high up on the periodic chart, but apparently, this is what we were observing.
How much of this element 115 was available? 200.
Well, there were 223 grams in the craft, in the reactor.
223 grams. I heard a story, I think it may have been from John Lear, that, and this jumps us way ahead, but that you somehow got some of element 115 out of that area. Is that true?
I really don't want to comment on that.
All right, I didn't think so. John didn't want to say much about it either, but that was a rumor. We'll let it stand as a rumor. All right, so element 115, something that we don't have yet. I think we have progressed a little bit up the scale, but we're certainly not at 115. Where are we now? What is our?
I believe the last isolated was 112.
112.
And
yep.
Most of the more recent work has been done in Darmstadt, Germany.
All right.
In fact, I believe their plan to produce element 116 is coming up next. I think they plan on. I think it was californium and calcium or something. Do you remember that, Gene?
Yes. I think they were going to fuse curium with calcium, and they were going to end up with element 116, which they then thought would decay in a chain of unknown nuclides and see where the island of stability actually settled.
But they are very close to attempting to pierce that island of stability and seeing what's going to happen. However, producing one or two atoms of it really isn't going to let them determine, how the substance is going to react. But at least they're there. They're almost to the point now where they can begin to look at some of these exotic substances.
Right. There are a lot of people waiting to see if they can perform any experiments or find this, gravity A that Bob alludes to. But really, when you read, and I'm certainly a layperson, when you read on these, for instance, the website for the Lab for Heavy Ion Research in Darmstadt, Germany, you can see that they actually detect these atoms when they make them, and getting an atom or two, it doesn't put them anywhere near having a quantity of it that you could hold in your hand and actually study for any macro scale type effect.
You bet. Bob, how long were you then at S4 doing your work?
It was from December of 88 to April of 89.
December of 88 to April of 89. Okay. What went wrong? When did the whole thing begin to go to sour, and why?
Boy, there's a long story. Okay, the Reader's Digest, this story.
Reader's Digest version.
Yeah, a Reader's Digest version of this, which is typically longer than the entire story itself.
Do you want me to tell it?
If you got a shorter version than I do, well, go ahead.
All right, how about this? At what stage of work were you when it began to go bad?
Well, very early. Well, go ahead, Gene. Give it a try.
Well, Bob had been on an on-call basis, and right when he got to the point where he's told you about up to this point, they stopped calling him into work, and this was very frustrating. He wasn't a fun guy to be around, and what had happened is when he, as he told you before, he had to sign documents allowing them to monitor his phone and fax and computer and anything that came into his house over a phone line. And to make a long, sad story short, Bob's wife was having an affair, and they found out. And when they gave him his security clearance, they deemed him to be financially stable, emotionally stable, and just generally stable. And so now they knew that he was going to be having some emotional problems, and they stopped calling him. Ultimately, they heard his wife admit that she had had an affair to her mother over the phone, and she ultimately told Bob. And they called him in and yanked his security clearance, saying that they deemed him to be a sure candidate for emotional instability, and that he could reapply again in 6 to 9 months. So
I've never heard any of this before.
You've never heard this?
No.
Yeah, that's the reason that he lost his clearance. It had nothing to do with him.
All right. Well, you had signed all these papers, Bob. What motivated you to go public? I mean, that's weird in itself. I mean, why did you go public? Surely you had to worry about your life, you had to worry about your career, and I don't know whether everybody knows, but you were virtually, the modern term is erased. Your educational records were erased. A lot of the work you did in New Mexico was erased, save for one little mistake. I think your name was, and still is, recorded in a phone book, isn't it?
Right. For the most part, everything was.
What was it they missed? Where was that? A phone book where?
That was, it was an old phone book in Los Alamos.
Los Alamos.
However, certainly they couldn't erase the, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, the newspaper article at that time clearly stated on the front page of the local Los Alamos newspaper that I was a physicist working in Los Alamos labs.
Yes.
So, they certainly couldn't go back and make that disappear. But
they made a lot disappear, didn't they?
Yeah. However, Art, they did lie to begin with. As you know, George Knapp, for your listeners, is the